The crimson dawn of June 4th, 1942, painted the Pacific horizon as Admiral Kiichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, his weathered hands gripping the rail. 6 months had passed since Pearl Harbor, and the Imperial Japanese Navy had swept across the Pacific like an unstoppable tsunami. Yet beneath his stoic exterior, Nagumo harbored doubts about Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's ambitious plan to lure the American fleet into a decisive battle at Midway Atoll. The morning air thrummed with the drone of aircraft engines as Zero fighters and dive bombers prepared for launch. Nagumo's mobile force, designated Kido Butai, represented the cream of Japanese naval aviation. 4 fleet carriers Akagi, Kaga, Haryu, and Soryu accompanied by 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. It was the same force that had devastated Pearl Harbor, and confidence ran high among the crews. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fukita, the man who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, supervised the pre-dawn preparations aboard Akagi. The veteran pilot's keen eyes surveyed the organized chaos of the flight deck, as mechanics made final adjustments to aircraft and ordnance crews loaded bombs. The plan seemed flawless. Strike Midway's defenses, draw out the American fleet, and destroy it in decisive battle. According to historical accounts from the Naval History and Heritage Command, the Japanese force assembled for Operation Mi represented the largest concentration of carrier power ever deployed at that time. 300 miles to the northeast, Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance commanded Task Force 16 from the bridge of the aircraft carrier Enterprise. Unlike his Japanese counterpart, Spruance possessed a crucial advantage. Advantage American codebreakers had penetrated the Japanese naval cipher, revealing Yamamoto's intentions. The quiet, methodical admiral had positioned his 2 carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, along with their escorts, in what he hoped would be the perfect ambush position. The contrast between the 2 commanders could not have been starker. While Nagumo carried the weight of 6 months of unbroken victory, Spruance bore the burden of America's desperate situation in the Pacific. The Philippines had fallen, the Dutch East Indies lay in Japanese hands, and Australia itself seemed threatened. This battle would determine whether the rising sun would continue its relentless march across the Pacific, or whether America could begin its long road back. As the sun climbed higher, both fleets steamed toward their destiny, unaware that they were about to engage in what historians would later call the most important naval battle of the Pacific War. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test not only the skill and courage of thousands of sailors and airmen, but also the industrial might and strategic vision of 2 great nations locked in mortal combat. The first Japanese strike wave, 108 aircraft strong, lifted off from their carriers at 600 hours, their destination, the American base, at Midway Atoll. As the bombers and fighters disappeared into the morning haze, neither Nagumo nor his pilots realized they were flying toward a carefully prepared trap that would shatter Japanese naval supremacy forever. In the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters in Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort hunched over his desk, surrounded by stacks of intercepted Japanese radio transmissions. For months, his cryptanalysis team had labored tirelessly to crack the Japanese Navy's operational code, designated J-125 by American intelligence. Their breakthrough had come at a crucial moment, revealing Admiral Yamamoto's ambitious plan to seize Midway Atoll and destroy the remnants of the Pacific Fleet in one decisive stroke. The intelligence coup was remarkable in its completeness. Rochefort's team had identified not only the target designated AF in Japanese communications, but also the composition of the attacking force, their approach routes, and even the timing of the assault. Armed with this intelligence, Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, had positioned his available forces for what he hoped would be a devastating ambush. The American defensive preparations had been meticulous. Despite having only 3 operational aircraft carriers Enterprise, Hornet and the hastily repaired Yorktown Nimitz had achieved rough parity in aircraft with the Japanese force. More importantly, the Americans would fight within range of Midway's land-based aircraft, effectively giving them a 4th unsinkable carrier. Historical records from the National Security Agency's declassified files confirm that the intelligence breakthrough at Station HYPO was one of the most significant achievements in the history of cryptanalysis. Captain Elliot Buckmaster stood on Yorktown's bridge, as his damaged carrier steamed toward the battle zone. Just 2 days earlier, his ship had limped into Pearl Harbor after the Battle of the Coral Sea, bearing wounds that normally would have required months in dry dock. Through superhuman effort, shipyard workers had patched her up in 72 hours, welding steel plates over bomb damage and jury-rigging essential systems. She was not fully battle-ready, but she was ready enough. The American plan relied on precise timing and coordination. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, the overall tactical commander, would position Task Force 17 with Yorktown northeast of Midway, while Spruance's Task Force 16 took station farther north. When the Japanese carriers launched their strike against Midway, they would be vulnerable to American counterattack. Their decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. As dawn broke on June 4th, the trap was set. On Midway itself, Marine and Navy pilots prepared their obsolescent Brewster Buffalo fighters and Douglas, dauntless dive bombers for what many knew might be a suicide mission. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Shannon's Marine Aircraft Group 22 had been reinforced with every available aircraft. From ancient Vindicator scout bombers to brand-new B-26 Marauders that had barely arrived from the mainland, the American forces faced daunting odds. The Japanese pilots were veterans of 6 months of continuous combat, their aircraft superior in most respects to American equipment. The vaunted Zero fighter had established an aura of invincibility throughout the Pacific. Moreover, Japanese naval aviation doctrine emphasized concentrated carrier operations, allowing them to mass overwhelming firepower against any target. Yet the Americans possessed advantages beyond intelligence. Their pilots, while less experienced in combat, had trained intensively in dive bombing techniques. Their aircraft, though older, were ruggedly built and could absorb tremendous punishment. Most importantly, they were fighting for their homeland, knowing that defeat at Midway might open the way for Japanese invasion of Hawaii, or even the American West Coast. As the first Japanese aircraft appeared on Midway's radar screens at 5:53 in the morning, both sides prepared for a battle that would determine the course of the Pacific War. At 0630 hours, air raid sirens wailed across Midway Atoll as the first wave of Japanese aircraft approached from the northwest. Lieutenant Tominaga Joichi led 36 Nakajima B-5N Cape bombers, escorted by 36 Aichi D-3 Val dive bombers and 36 Mitsubishi IS-6M0 fighters in a perfectly coordinated assault formation. The morning sun glinted off their wings as they descended toward their target like mechanical birds of prey. Marine Captain John Carey led 26 obsolescent Brewster F-2A Buffalo fighters up to meet them, knowing his aircraft were outclassed by the nimble Zeros. The American pilots had received grim instructions: attack the bombers at all costs, even if it meant ignoring the escort fighters. As the two formations closed, the sky above Midway erupted in a deadly ballet of aerial combat. The Zeros proved their lethal reputation immediately. Captain Kara's fighters, climbing desperately to gain altitude, found themselves overwhelmed by the superior Japanese machines. Within minutes, 15 of the 26 American fighters had been shot down, their pilots killed or wounded in the unequal contest. Yet their sacrifice was not in vain. They had disrupted the bomber formations and forced the Japanese to expend precious fuel and ammunition. Below, the defenders of Midway braced for impact. Marine anti-aircraft gunners tracked their targets through rangefinders, waiting for the bombers to come within effective range. The atoll's defensive batteries had been reinforced with every available weapon, from modern 5-inch guns to antiquated 3-inch pieces pressed into service from obsolete warships. Contemporary military records from the Marine Corps Historical Center document the fierce resistance put up by the Midway garrison despite being heavily outgunned. The Japanese bombing was devastating but incomplete. Tominaga's aircraft pounded the airfield facilities, destroying fuel storage tanks and damaging the runway. Hangar 2 disappeared in a tremendous explosion that sent debris flying across Eastern Island. The Marine Command Post took a direct hit, killing several key personnel and temporarily disrupting communications. Black smoke billowed into the tropical sky as fires raged across the atoll. Yet Midway's defensive installations remained largely intact. The crucial radar station continued operating, providing vital early warning of subsequent attacks. Most importantly, the runway remained serviceable, allowing American aircraft to continue operations. As the Japanese bombers withdrew, Tominaga radioed a fateful message to Admiral Nagumo. second attack necessary. This single transmission would prove decisive. Nagumo had held back a second strike wave armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes, intended for use against American warships when they appeared. Now faced with the need for another attack on Midway, he made the critical decision to rearm his aircraft with high-explosive bombs suitable for land targets. As Japanese aircraft began landing back on their carriers, the tedious process of rearming began. Ordnance crews worked frantically to remove torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs from the reserve aircraft, placing them with high-explosive weapons. Fuel lines snaked across the carrier decks as ground crews topped off partially empty tanks. For nearly an hour, the Japanese flight decks became magazines of volatile aviation fuel and explosive ordnance. Meanwhile, from Midway's damaged but still operational airfield, American strike aircraft began taking off in ones and twos. Captain William Collins led 16 Marine Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers toward the Japanese fleet, followed by Captain James Meary's 4th Army Air Force B-1A6 Marauders flying their first combat mission. These obsolescent aircraft and inexperienced crews represented America's first counterpunch in what was rapidly becoming the most important naval battle of the Pacific War. The stage was set for the climactic phase of the battle. Japanese carriers lay vulnerable, their decks crowded with aircraft and ordnance. While American strike forces converged from multiple directions, the next few hours would determine whether the rising sun would continue its advance across the Pacific, or whether American arms would begin their long march to victory. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron adjusted his goggles and checked his instruments one final time as his Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bomber lifted off from the USS Hornet's flight deck. Behind him, 14 more ancient aircraft from Torpedo Squadron 8 struggled into formation, their obsolescent airframes groaning under the weight of Mark 13 torpedoes that had a distressing tendency to malfunction. Waldron had trained his men for this moment, but he harbored no illusions about their chances against the Japanese fleet. The TBD Devastator was a death trap, slow, unarmored, and carrying a torpedo that required a long straight run-in at low altitude to ensure accuracy. Against the lightning-fast Zeros and the concentrated anti-aircraft fire of the Japanese fleet, it was virtually suicide. Yet these were the only torpedo bombers available to the American fleet, and carrier doctrine demanded that they coordinate their attack with dive bombers to overwhelm enemy defenses. Waldron led his squadron southwest toward the last known position of the Japanese carriers. His navigation was superb, trained as an Annapolis graduate and veteran naval aviator. He had and behind him flew young pilots like Ensign George Gay, barely 20 and flying his first combat mission, and Chief Petty Officer Robert Huntington, a grizzled veteran who had enlisted in the Navy during the Great Depression. According to official Navy records from the Naval Aviation History Office, Torpedo Squadron 8's attack exemplified the courage and sacrifice of early Pacific War aviators. At 092 hours, Waldron spotted smoke on the horizon, the Japanese carriers exactly where his instincts had told him they would be. He waggled his wings to signal his squadron and began his descent toward the enemy fleet. The radio crackled with his final transmission. Attack immediately. Then 15 obsolete torpedo bombers dove toward the most powerful naval force in the world. The Japanese response was swift and overwhelming. Admiral Nagumo's carriers had launched every available Zero fighter, and they fell upon the American torpedo bombers like hawks on sparrows. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Itaya, one of Japan's most experienced fighter pilots, led the combat air patrol in a perfectly coordinated attack that shredded the American formation. One by one, the TBD Devastators fell into the Pacific. Waldron's aircraft was among the first hit, taking cannon fire from 2 Zeros before plummeting into the sea. And Singay watched in horror as his squadron mates died around him, their aircraft burning as they crashed into the waves. The torpedo attack was a complete tactical failure. Not a single torpedo found its target, and 14 of the 15 aircraft were destroyed. Gay was the sole survivor, floating in his life jacket among the wreckage, while watching the battle unfold around him. Yet the sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 was not in vain. Their suicidal attack had drawn the Japanese combat air, patrolled down to sea level, and scattered the escort fighters across the ocean. Similar scenes played out as Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise and Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown pressed home their own attacks. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay led Enterprise's torpedo bombers in another low-level assault that was cut to pieces by Japanese fighters. Of the 14 aircraft that attacked, only 4 returned. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown fared slightly better, but still lost 10 of 12 aircraft without scoring a hit. The massacre of the American torpedo squadrons seemed to confirm Japanese naval supremacy. In less than an hour, 41 of America's most experienced torpedo bomber pilots had been killed or wounded. Their obsolescent aircraft proving no match for Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft guns. Radio Tokyo would later broadcast triumphant reports of American defeat, claiming that the Pacific Fleet had been decisively beaten. But high above the carnage, unnoticed by the Japanese fighters locked in combat with the torpedo bombers, American dive bombers were approaching their targets. The sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons had created the perfect opportunity for a coordinated attack that would change the course of the Pacific War in a matter of minutes. At 10:20 hours, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey circled high above the empty ocean in his Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber. Fuel gauge showing critically low levels and no sign of the Japanese fleet. McCluskey, leading Enterprise's air group, had been searching for over an hour based on faulty intelligence that had placed the enemy carriers far to the south of their actual position. His 37 dive bombers were approaching the point where they would have insufficient fuel to return to their carrier. In a decision that would alter the course of history, McCluskey chose to continue the search rather than return empty-handed. Banking northeast, he followed the wake of a Japanese destroyer speeding toward the main fleet. Below the waves, the lone vessel, the destroyer Arashi, was racing to rejoin Nagumo's formation after depth-charging the American submarine USS Nautilus. Unknowingly, she was leading the American dive bombers directly to their target. At 10:22, McCluskey spotted them. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers arranged in a rough box formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. The sight was everything an American dive bomber pilot could hope for. The entire Japanese mobile force caught in their most vulnerable state, with no fighter cover at altitude, and their decks turned into floating ammunition dumps. McCluskey immediately radioed his attack order and pushed over into his diving attack, selecting the massive carrier Kaga as his target. Behind him, the dive bombers of Scouting Squadron 6 and Bombing Squadron 6 followed in textbook fashion. Their aircraft screaming down at 70-degree angles from 14,000 feet, the Japanese, focused on the low-level torpedo attacks that had been harassing them all morning, were caught completely by surprise. Military historians from the Naval War College have extensively documented this attack as one of the most decisive moments in naval warfare history. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie led Yorktown's dive bombers against the carrier Soryu. His bombing Squadron 3 had become separated from its fighter escort during the approach, but Leslie pressed on anyway, leading 17 SBD Dauntlesses in a perfectly coordinated attack. The Japanese carrier had no warning her crew was still engaged in rearming aircraft when the American bombs began falling. A second bomb penetrated the hangar deck, setting off more stored ordnance and fuel. Within minutes, the proud carrier that had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor was a blazing wreck. Soryu suffered an even more devastating fate. Leslie's dive bombers achieved 3 direct hits in rapid succession, each bomb detonating among fueled and armed aircraft. The carrier's entire center section erupted in flames, as aviation gasoline created rivers of fire that spread throughout the ship. Her crew fought desperately to contain the damage, but the fires had taken hold too quickly and burned too hot to control. The third Japanese carrier, Akagi Admiral Nagumo's flagship, met a similar doom. A single 1,000-pound bomb from Lieutenant Richard Best's aircraft struck near the carrier's central elevator, penetrating to the hangar deck where it detonated among stored torpedoes and bombs. The explosion was so violent that it buckled the flight deck and set off a chain reaction of secondary blasts that gutted the ship's interior. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers had been mortally wounded. The cream of Japanese naval aviation veteran pilots who had trained for years, an aircraft that represented months of skilled manufacturing, was consumed in fires that could not be controlled. Only Hiryu remained undamaged, hidden in a rain squall to the north of the main formation. Her captain, Rear Admiral Taemon Yamaguchi, immediately began preparing a counterattack. Knowing that his single carrier now faced the entire American fleet, the Rising Sun had suffered its first major defeat of the Pacific War, but the battle was far from over. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Hiryu, watching pillars of black smoke rise from his sister ships as they died in agony. Kagi Kaga and Sorya, the pride of the Japanese fleet, were burning hulks drifting helplessly in the Pacific swells around him. His staff officers struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster that had befallen the mobile force in mere minutes. Yet Yamaguchi, known throughout the Japanese Navy for his aggressive spirit and tactical brilliance, had no intention of retreating. His carrier remained undamaged, hidden from American scouts by a fortuitous rain squall, although he possessed only 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters, a fraction of the force that had departed. Japan, with such confidence, he was determined to strike back at the Americans who had humiliated the Imperial Navy. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led the hastily assembled strike force as it lifted off from Hiryu's deck at 10:58 hours. The veteran pilot had participated in every major Japanese carrier operation since Pearl Harbor, and his calm professionalism steadied the younger aircrews who were visibly shaken by the morning's catastrophe. Their target was the American carrier Yorktown, located by Japanese reconnaissance aircraft approximately 100 miles to the southeast, according to Japanese naval records preserved in the archives of the Japan Defense Agency. Admiral Yamaguchi's decision to counterattack exemplified the fighting spirit that characterized the Imperial Navy throughout the war. The Japanese strike encountered fierce resistance as it approached Task Force 17. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, leading Yorktown's fighter squadron, pioneered a new defensive tactic that became known as the Thatch Weave, a scissors maneuver that allowed 2 fighters to provide mutual support against the more maneuverable Zeros. Despite being outnumbered, the American fighters managed to shoot down several Japanese aircraft and disrupt their attack formation. Captain Elliot Buckmaster's crew responded magnificently, the lessons learned at Coral Sea paying dividends as damage control parties rushed to their stations. The carrier's anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with bursting shells, creating a deadly barrage that claimed several more Japanese aircraft. 3 bombs struck Yorktown in quick succession. The first penetrated the flight deck near the island, starting fires in the hangar. The second bomb destroyed the ship's radar and communications equipment. The third, most damaging hit penetrated deep into the carrier's vitals, knocking out her boilers and bringing her to a dead stop. Within minutes, the ship was listing heavily to port and appeared to be sinking. Japanese pilots radioed triumphant reports back to Hiryu, claiming to have sunk an American carrier. Admiral Yamaguchi immediately began preparing a second strike, intending to finish off the damaged ship and locate other American carriers. However, Yorktown's crew proved remarkably resilient. Led by Commander Clarence Aldrich, damage control teams worked miracles, shoring up bulkheads, fighting fires, and restoring power to essential systems. By 30 hours, Yorktown was underway again at 20 knots. Her flight deck operational despite the damage. When Japanese reconnaissance aircraft spotted her later that afternoon, they reported her as a different, undamaged carrier, leading Yamaguchi to believe the Americans had more ships than intelligence had indicated. This misidentification would prove crucial to his tactical decisions. At 13:31, Hiryu launched her second and final strike. 10 torpedo bombers escorted by 6 fighters. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, wounded in the morning's attack on Midway, but insisting on flying despite his injuries, led this desperate mission knowing his fuel supply was insufficient for a return flight. It was a one-way mission for many of the aircrew, a final samurai charge against overwhelming odds. The second Japanese attack achieved what the first had failed to accomplish. Despite heroic efforts by Yorktown's defenders, 2 torpedoes struck the carrier's port side, flooding her engine rooms and causing severe flooding. This time the damage was too extensive to repair quickly. Buckmaster reluctantly gave the order to abandon ship, and Yorktown's crew began the heartbreaking process of leaving their wounded vessel. Yet, even as Hiryu's aircrew celebrated their success, American dive bombers were already approaching their ship. The last Japanese carrier in the mobile force was about to face the same fate that had befallen her sisters earlier that morning. At 17:05 hours, Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher led 24 Douglas SBD, dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise in a steep dive toward the Japanese carrier Haryu, the lone surviving ship of Admiral WWII's once mighty mobile force twisted desperately through the Pacific swells, her flight deck crowded with aircraft preparing for yet another strike against the American fleet. For the third time that day, Japanese carriers would discover the devastating effectiveness of American dive bombing. Rear Admiral Tomoe Yamaguchi watched from Hiryu's bridge as the American aircraft descended like falling stars. The ship's anti-aircraft guns opened fire, filling the afternoon sky with bursting shells, while the few remaining Zero fighters climbed desperately to intercept the attackers. But it was too little, too late. The Americans had learned their lessons well from the morning's attacks and pressed home their assault with deadly precision. 4 bombs struck Hiryu in rapid succession. First exploded among aircraft spotted on the forward flight deck, creating the same devastating fires that had consumed her sister ships. The second bomb penetrated the hangar deck, where aviation fuel and armed ordnance created a massive secondary explosion. Within minutes, the last Japanese fleet carrier was blazing from bow to stern, her crew fighting desperately against fires that could not be controlled. Yamaguchi, known throughout the Japanese Navy as one of its finest tactical minds, faced the bitter reality of defeat. Standing amid the smoke and flames of his dying ship, he composed his final message to Admiral Yamamoto. "Hiryu severely damaged. We are preparing to ram enemy carrier. Will inform you of results." It was a message that epitomized the samurai spirit of the Imperial Navadeath before dishonor, victory, or annihilation. Historical records from the Imperial Japanese Navy, now housed in the National Institute for Defense Studies in Tokyo, document Admiral Yamaguchi's final hours aboard the stricken carrier. Yet even as Hiryu burned, the battle's final act was being played out in the gathering darkness. The Japanese submarine I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Yahachi Tanabe, had been stalking the American fleet since morning. At 15:36 hours, she achieved perfect firing position on the damaged carrier Yorktown, which was being taken in tow by the destroyer Hammond. 4 torpedoes streaked through the clear Pacific water toward their targets. The submarine attack was devastatingly effective. 1 torpedo struck Hammond amidships, breaking her back and sinking her within minutes. 2 more torpedoes tore massive holes in Yorktown's port side, causing catastrophic flooding that doomed the carrier. The ship that had survived Coral Sea and the morning's air attacks finally succumbed to her wounds, rolling over and sinking at dawn on June 7th. As darkness fell on June 4th, 1942, the magnitude of the Japanese defeat became clear. For fleet carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had been sunk along with a heavy cruiser and several destroyers. More importantly, over 300 veteran aircrew had perished. Pilots who represented years of training and combat experience that could not be quickly replaced. The cream of Japanese naval aviation lay at the bottom of the Pacific,